All right, guys, welcome back. I guess technically this would be officially day 18 is what I'll have it as, but this is the finishing up of chapter 12 and finishing up the book. So we were on page 194, the first little, after that paragraph had finished from there. So remember, they were up on the rock trying to get Ralph out of there. Sam and Eric had snitched on Ralph, saying that he would be hiding in there. So now they're trying to throw big rocks down like they did on Piggy. So here we go. Page 194. Ralph knelt on the plowed up soil and waited for the earth to come back. Presently, the white, broken stumps, the split sticks and the tangle of the thicket refocused. There was a kind of heavy feeling in his body where he had watched his own pulse. Silence again. Yet not entirely so. They were whispering out there, and suddenly the branches were shaking furiously at two places on his right. The pointed end of the stick appeared. In panic, Ralph thrust his own stick through the crack and struck with all his might. Aha! His spear twisted in his little hands and then withdrew it again. Ooh! Ooh! Someone was moaning outside, and a babble of voices rose. A fierce argument was going on, and the wounded savage kept groaning. And then there was silence. A single voice spoke, and Ralph decided that it was not Jack's. See, I told you he's dangerous. The wounded savage moaned again. What else? What next? Ralph fastened his hands round the chewed spear, and his hair fell. Someone was muttering, only a few yards toward the castle rock. He heard a savage say no in a shocked voice. And then there was suppressed laughter. He squatted back on his heels and showed his teeth in the wall of branches. He raised his spear and snarled a little and waited. Once more the invisible group sniggered. He heard a curious trickling sound and then a louder crepitation, as if someone were unwrapping great sheets of cellophane. A stick snapped, and then he stifled a cough. Smoke was seeping through the branches in white and yellow wisps. The patch of blue sky overhead turned to the color of a storm cloud, and then the smoke billowed around him. Someone laughed excitedly, and a voice shouted, "Smoke!" He wormed his way through the thicket toward the forest, keeping as far as possible beneath the smoke. Presently he saw open space and the green leaves of the edge of the thicket. A smaller savage was standing between him and the rest of the forest, a savage striped red and white and carrying a spear. He was coughing and smearing the paint about his eyes with the back of his hand as he tried to see through the increasing smoke. Ralph launched himself like a cat, stabbed, snarling, with the spear, and the savage doubled up. There was a shout from beyond the thicket, and then Ralph was running with the swiftness of fear through the undergrowth. He came to a pig run, followed it perhaps 100 yards, and then swerved off. Behind him, the ululation swept across the island once more, and a single voice shouted 3 times. He guessed that was a signal to advance, and sped away again, till his chest was like fire. Then he flung himself down under a bush and waited for a moment till his breathing steadied. He passed his tongue tentatively over his teeth and lips and heard far off the ululation of the pursuers. There were many things he could do. He could climb a tree, but that was putting all his eggs in one basket. If he were detected, they had nothing more difficult to do than wait. If only one had time to think. Another double cry at the same distance gave him a clue to their plan. Any savage balked in the forest would utter the double shout and hold up the line until he was free again. That way they might hope to keep the cordon unbroken right across the island. Ralph thought of the boar that had broken through them with such ease. If necessary, when the chase came too close, he could charge the cordon while it was still thin, bursting through and run back. But run back where? The cordon would turn and sweep again. Sooner or later he would have to sleep or eat, and then he would awaken the hands clawing at him. Then he would awaken with hands clawing at him, and the hunt would become a running down. What was to be done then? The tree? Burst the line like a boar? Either way, the choice was terrible. A single cry quickened his heartbeat, and leaping up, he dashed away toward the ocean side and the thick jungle till he was hung up among creepers. He stayed there for a moment, with his calves quivering. If only one could have a quiet, long pause, a time to think. And there again, shrill and inevitable, was the ululation sweeping across the island. At the sound of the shield, like a horse among the creepers, and ran once more till he was panting. He flung himself down by some ferns, the tree or the charge. He mastered his breathing for a moment, wiped his mouth, and told himself to be calm. Sam and Eric were somewhere in that line, and hating it. Or were they? And supposing, instead of them, he met the chief, or Roger, who carried death in his hands. Ralph pushed back his tangled hair and wiped the sweat out of his eye. He spoke aloud. Think. What was the sensible thing to do? There was no piggy to talk sense. There was no solemn assembly for debate, nor dignity of the comp. Think. Most, he was beginning to dread the curtain that might waver in his brain, blacking out the sense of danger, making a simpleton of him. A third idea would be to hide so well that advancing line would pass without discovering him. He jerked his head off the ground and listened. There was another noise to attend to now, a deep grumbling noise, as though the forest itself were angry with him. A somber noise across which the ululations were scribbled excruciatingly as on slate. He knew he had heard it before, somewhere, but had no time to remember. Break the line. A tree. Hide. Let them pass. A nearer cry stood him on his feet, and immediately he was away again, running fast among thorns and brambles. Suddenly he blundered into the open, found himself again in that open space, and there he was, fathom-wide grin of the skull, no longer ridiculing a deep blue patch of sky, but jeering up into a blanket of smoke. Then Ralph was running beneath trees. With the grumble of the forest explained, they had smoked him out and set the island on fire. Hide was better than a tree because you had a chance of breaking the line if you were discovered. Hide then. He wondered if the pig would agree, and grimaced at nothing, find the deepest thicket and the darkest hole in the island and creep in. Now, as he ran, he peered about him. Bars and splashes of sunlight flitted over him, and sweat made glistening streaks on his dirty body. The cries were far now and faint. At last he found what seemed to him the right place, though the decision was desperate. Here, bushes and a wild tangle of creeper made a mat that kept out all the light of the sun. Beneath it was a space, perhaps a foot high, though it was pierced everywhere by parallel and rising stems. If you wormed into the middle of that, you would be 5 yards from the edge, and hidden, unless the savage chose to lie down and look for you. And even then, you would be in darkness. And if the worst happened, and he saw you, then you'd have a chance to burst out at him, fling the whole line out of step, and double back. Cautiously, his stick trailing behind him, Ralph wormed between the rising stems. He reached the middle of the mat. He lay and listened. The fire was a big one, and the drum roll that he had thought was left so far behind was near. Couldn't a fire outrun a galloping horse? He could see the sun-splashed ground over an area of perhaps 50 yards from where he lay, and as he watched, the sunlight in every patch blinked at him. This was so like the curtain that flapped in his brain for a moment. He thought the blinking was inside him, But then the patches blinked more rapidly, dulled and went out, so that he saw the great heaviness of smoke lay between the island and the sun. If anyone appeared under the bushes and chanced to glimpse human flesh, it might be Salmon Eric, who would pretend not to see and say nothing. He laid his cheek against the chocolate-colored earth, licked his dry lips, and closed his eyes. Under the thicket, the earth was vibrating very slightly, or perhaps there was a sound beneath the obvious thunder of the fire and scribbled ululations. And that was too low to hear. Someone cried out. Ralph jerked his cheek off the earth and looked into the dulled light. They must be near now, he thought, and his chest began to thump. Hide, break the line, climb a tree. Which was the best after all? The trouble was you only had one chance. Now the fire was near. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even, bursting. The fools! The fire must be almost at the fruit trees. What would they eat tomorrow? Ralph stirred restlessly in his narrow bed. One chance nothing what they could do. What could they do? Beat him? So what? Kill him? A stick sharpened at both ends. The cry suddenly near jerked him up. He could see a striped savage moving hastily out of the green tangle and coming toward the mat where he hid. A savage who carried a spear. Ralph gripped his fingers into the earth. And be ready now, in case. Ralph fumbled to hold his spear so that it was point foremost. And now he saw the stick was sharpened at both ends. The savage stopped 15 yards away and uttered his cry. Perhaps he could hear my heart over the noises of the fire. Don't scream. Get ready. The savage moved forward so that you could only see him from the waist down. That was the butt of his spear. Now you could see him from the knee down. Don't scream. A herd of pigs came squealing out of the greenery behind the savage and rushed away into the forest. Birds were screaming, mice shrieking, and the little hopping thing that came from under the mat and cowered. 5 yards away, the savage stopped, standing right by the thicket, and cried out. Ralph drew his feet up and crouched. The stake was in his hands, the stake sharpened at both ends. The stake that vibrated so wildly that grew long, short, light, heavy, light again. The ululation spread from the shore to shore. The savage knelt down by the edge of the thicket, and there were lights flickering in the forest behind him. You could see a knee disturb the mold. Now, the other, 2 hands, a spear, a face. The savage peered into the obscurity beneath the thicket. You could tell that he saw light on the side, on this side and on that, but not in the middle. There. In the middle was a blob of dark, and the savage wrinkled up his face, trying to decipher the darkness. The seconds lengthened. Ralph was looking straight into the savage's eyes. Don't scream, you'll get back. Now he's seen you. He's making sure. A stick sharpened. Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened. The screams became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst the thicket, was in the open, screaming, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake, and the savage tumbled over, but there were others coming toward him, crying out. He swerved as a spear flew past, and then was silent, running. All at once, the lights flickering ahead of him merged together. The roar of the forest rose to thunder, and a tall bush directly in his path burst into a great fan-shaped flame. He swung to the right, running desperately fast, with the heat beating on his left side and the fire racing toward like a tide. The ululation rose behind him and spread along a series of short, sharp cries, the sighting call. A brown figure... Hey, guys, can you quiet down a little bit, please? A brown figure showed up at his right, and fell away. They were all running, all crying out madly. He could hear them crashing in the undergrowth, and on the left was the hot, bright thunder of the fire. He forgot his wounds, his hunger, and his thirst, and became fear. Hopeless fear on flying feet. Rushing through the forest toward the open beach, spots jumped before his eyes and turned into red circles that expanded quickly till they passed out of sight. Below him, someone's legs were getting tired, and the desperate ululation advanced, like a jagged fringe of menace, and was almost overheard. He stumbled over a root, and the cry that pursued him rose even higher. He saw a shelter burst into flames, and the fire flapped. At his right shoulder, and there was the glitter of water. Then he was down, rolling over and over in the warm sand, crouching with arm to ward off, trying to cry for mercy. He staggered to his feet, tense for more terrors, and looked up at the huge peaked cap. It was a white-topped cap, and above the green shade of the peak was a crown, an anchor, gold foliage. He saw a white drill, epaulets, a revolver, a row of gilt buttons down the front of a uniform. Ella, quiet please. A naval officer stood on the sand, looking down at Ralph in a worry astonishment. On the beach behind him was a cutter, her bows hauled up and held by two ratings. In the stern sheets, another rating held a submachine gun. The ululation faltered and died away. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment, then took his hand away from the butt of the revolver. Hello. Squirming a little conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, Hello. The officer nodded, as if the question had been answered. Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you? Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half-pace of sand. A semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp sticks in their hands, were standing on the beach making no noise at all. Fun and games, said the officer. The fire reached the coconut palms and by the beach and swallowed them noisily. A flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something? Ralph nodded. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a bath, a haircut, a nose wipe, and a good deal of ointment. Nobody killed, I hope? Any dead bodies? Only 2, and they've gone. The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. 2? Killed? Ralph nodded. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew, as a rule, when people were telling the truth. He whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown, with the distended bellies of small savages. One of them came close to the officer and looked up. But there was no more to come. Percival Wemyss Madison sought in the head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned back to Ralph. We'll take you off. How many of you are there? Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past him to a group of painted boys. Who's boss here? I am, said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of you there are? No, sir. I should have thought, said the officer as he visualized the search before him. I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first, said Ralph. Before things, he stopped. We were together then. The officer nodded helpfully. I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island. Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that he had once invested the beaches. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had. The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island, great shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of the man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. And that's it. So, they were rescued. Fabulous. See what these questions have in store for us today. For chapters 11 and 12, who tells Ralph they're going to do you, and what does that mean? They went up to that rock and he found someone, and what they're going to do you. You could say they're going to do you. They're going to do you in. What will Jack do to Ralph if the boys capture Ralph? You should know that answer. Theme is the underlying truth of a story, and is what the plot means. There are many interwoven themes in Lord of the Flies. Which of the following is not considered a theme of the novel? And your options are: true love and devotion will win in the end, the loss of identity, innocence and the loss of it, the need for civilization, power, fear of the unknown. So which one of those themes did you not see in this book? 65. Which statement below is true regarding the assemblies Jack holds compared with those of Ralph? So Ralph encourages discussion from all those who wish to express themselves. Jack gives orders and assumes that the only person with any valuable knowledge is the chief, and everyone must do as they say, both A and B, or neither, or none of them. 66. Who appears at the beach as Ralph is running for his life? Jack and the Hunters, the Beast, Ralph's father, or a British naval officer? What happens to the conch? What makes Piggy a tragic hero in the novel? He is willing to give up his glasses for the good of all concerned. He defends his beliefs and is determined to retrieve his glasses, even though his situation is hopeless. He is willing to attack Jack and his hunters because he knows that is the right thing to do. He died twitching like a dying pig. And why can't Piggy see anymore? We should know that answer. All right. And number 20, write an essay using specific examples from the novel in which you discuss the implications and importance of protecting civilization and its freedoms, especially the freedoms of choice. Now, I would love for you to write a little essay on this, and why is it important that we do have a civilized civilization? Why do we have order and things like that? So, all important things that I really would love to discuss in class, but here we are, and still doing NTI. So, with that being said, guys, that is it. There's some review questions there. So, there's some review questions after that question 70 that, you guys should know. But if you guys want to talk on whenever you finish, feel free to email me or to FaceTime me in any way. So, with that being said, I hope you'll enjoy the book. I know I did. It's been a long time since I've read it, probably close to 20 years, but a book that I'll never forget. And a book that I enjoyed again. So with that being said, I'm out, and I will talk to you all later. See ya.